you notice that we're kind of preempting a lot of things in our service because we want to give Dr. Craig just as much time as possible to do his presentation this morning. We're very happy to have him. What he's doing for you today, he does all over the world in many settings, including in college campuses as a Christian theologian. He loves talking about the two subjects he's going to be talking about today. And so again, we're doing our best to expedite things. So I'm going to ask Dr. Craig if you'll go ahead and come at this time and make his presentation to us today.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, and thank you for coming this morning. And I want to thank Ventura Baptist Church as well for setting aside their morning services for these two special sessions. Obviously, I can't answer all your questions this morning, but the Christian worldview rests upon two fundamental pillars: the existence of God and God's special revelation in Jesus of Nazareth. And so those are the two questions that I want to address this morning. If you believe that God exists and that he has specially revealed himself in Jesus, then you ought to become a Christian. And the rest will be just working out the details. So in our morning session first today, we want to talk about the question of God's existence. And then in the second session, we'll look at how God has revealed himself in Jesus of Nazareth. The British writer C.S. Lewis once remarked that God is not the sort of thing that you can be moderately interested in. Think about it. If God does not exist, then there's no reason to be interested in him at all. On the other hand, if God does exist, then this is supremely interesting. And life's most important question will be, how am I to be rightly related to this being upon whom I depend moment by moment for my very existence? So, people who shrug their shoulders and say, what difference does it make whether God exists, merely show that they haven't thought very deeply about this question. Even atheist philosophers like Russell and Sartre, who have thought deeply about this question, recognize that the existence of God makes a tremendous difference for human beings. So let me just mention three reasons to begin with as to why it makes a big difference whether God exists. Number one, if God does not exist, then life is ultimately meaningless. If your life is doomed to end in death, then ultimately it does not matter how you live. In the end, it makes no ultimate difference whether you ever even existed or not. Now, to be sure, your life might have a relative significance in that you influenced others or affected the course of history. But ultimately, mankind is doomed to perish in the heat death of an expanding universe. Ultimately, it makes no difference who you are or what you do. Your life is literally inconsequential. Thus, the contributions of the scientist to the advance of human knowledge, the researches of the doctor to alleviate pain and suffering, the efforts of the diplomat to secure peace in the world, the sacrifices of good people everywhere to better the lot of the human race, in the end, all of these come to nothing. Thus, if atheism is true, then life is ultimately meaningless. Secondly, if God does not exist, then we must ultimately live without hope. If there is no God, then ultimately there is no hope for deliverance from the shortcomings of a finite existence. For example, there's no hope for deliverance from evil. Although many people ask how God could create a world involving so much evil as this one, by far most of the suffering in the world is due to man's own inhumanity to man. The horror of 2 world wars during the last century effectively destroyed the 19th century's naive optimism about the inevitability of human progress. If God does not exist, then we are locked without hope in a world filled with gratuitous and unredeemed suffering, and there is no hope for deliverance from evil. Or again, if there is no God, there's no hope for deliverance from aging, disease, and death. It may be hard for those of you who are young to contemplate, but the fact is that unless you die young, you yourself will someday be an old man or an old woman fighting a losing battle against aging, struggling against the inevitable advance of deterioration, disease, maybe senility. And finally and inevitably, you will die. There is no afterlife beyond the grave. And thus, atheism is a philosophy without hope. Third, on the other hand, if God does exist, then not only are meaning and hope possible, but it's also possible that you might come to know God and His love personally. Now think of it, that the infinite God should love you and want to be your personal friend. This would be the highest status that a human being could enjoy. Clearly, if God does exist, it not only makes a tremendous difference for mankind in general, but it could make a life-changing difference for you personally as well. Now, admittedly, none of this shows that God exists, but it does show that it makes a tremendous difference whether God exists. And therefore, I'm inclined to say that even if the evidence for and against the existence of God were absolutely equal, the rational thing to do, I think, is to believe in God. That is to say, it seems to me that when the evidence is equal, it is positively irrational to prefer death, futility, and despair over hope, meaningfulness, and life. But in fact, I don't think that the scales of the evidence are evenly balanced. I think that there are good reasons to believe in God. And this morning I want to share very briefly with you 3 such reasons. Now, whole books have been written on each one of these, so all I have time to do is give a brief sketch of each argument, and then during the Q&A time we can go into more depth with any that you care to talk about. Now, as travelers along life's way, it's our goal to make sense of the world, to try to understand the way the world is. And the hypothesis that God exists makes sense out of a wide range of the data of human experience. First of all, God makes sense of the origin of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Why everything exists instead of just nothing? Well, typically atheists have said that the universe is just eternal, and that's all. But is that right? Well, take a look at this short video to introduce this first argument.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, Everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time. More recently, 3 leading cosmologists, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, prove that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
This first argument, as you can see, is based upon the beginning of the universe. And the video mentions scientific evidence for the universe's beginning, but there are also philosophical reasons to think that the universe began to exist. Just think about it for a minute. If the universe never began to exist, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But the existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to self-contradictions. For example, what is infinity minus infinity? Well, mathematically, you get self-contradictory answers. This shows that infinity is just a concept in your mind, not something that exists in reality. David Hilbert, who was perhaps the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, states, "The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea." But that entails that since past events are not just ideas but are real, the number of past events must be finite. And therefore the series of past events can't go back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. And this conclusion has now been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astrophysics and astronomy. One of the most startling developments of modern science is that we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning about 13.7 billion years ago, in a cataclysmic event called the Big Bang. And what makes the Big Bang so startling is that it represents the origin of the universe from literally nothing. All matter and energy, even physical space and time themselves, came into being at the moment of the Big Bang. Now, of course, scientific results are always provisional, and we can fully anticipate that new theories will be proposed attempting to avoid the universe's beginning. Such proposals are to be welcomed and tested. Nevertheless, it's pretty clear which way the evidence points. Today, the Christian theist stands comfortably within the scientific mainstream in holding that the universe began to exist. And that, of course, raises the inevitable question, why? Out of nothing, nothing comes. So why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? Where did it come from? There must have been a transcendent cause which brought the universe into being. And we can summarize this argument as follows. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Isn't it incredible that the Big Bang Theory thus confirms what the Christian theist has always believed, that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth? Now, I simply put it to you, which do you think is more probable, that the theist is right, or that the universe just popped into being uncaused out of nothing? I, at least, don't have any trouble assessing those alternatives. There's more to say, but time is pressing, so we'll go on to number 2. God makes sense of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. Take a look at this video to introduce this second argument.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would, again, be life-prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. What is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are three live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to this alternative, the universe must be life-permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this plausible? Is a life-prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a life-permitting universe. The constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no reason or evidence to suggest that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really, 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 really lucky? No. The probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. So, in an effort to keep this option alive, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach, known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator that cranks out such a vast number of universes that, odds are, life-permitting universes will eventually pop out. However, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable, observable universe would be a small one, inhabited by a single, simple observer. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we should least expect: a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe, inhabited by billions of other observers. So even if the multiverse existed, which is a moot point, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
Now, as this video explains, scientists have discovered that the existence of intelligent life depends upon a conspiracy of initial conditions of the universe, which must be fine-tuned to an incomprehensible precision in order for the universe to permit any sort of interactive, embodied life anywhere. Now, there are three possibilities in the literature for explaining this remarkable fine-tuning: either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these three alternatives is the best explanation? Well, physical necessity is extraordinarily implausible. There is no physical reason why these constants and quantities have the values they do, because they're independent of nature's laws. So what about the alternative of chance? Could the fine-tuning of the universe be due to chance? Well, the problem with this alternative is that the odds against the fine-tuning are so incomprehensibly great that they cannot be reasonably faced. And so in order to rescue the alternative of chance, its proponents have been forced to adopt the remarkable metaphysical hypothesis that there is an infinite number of randomly ordered parallel universes composing a sort of world ensemble or multiverse of which our universe is a part. And somewhere in this infinite ensemble, finely tuned universes will appear by chance, and we happen to be, luckily, in one such world. But as the video explains, there are at least two major problems with the world ensemble hypothesis. First, there's absolutely no evidence for it. The eminent cosmologist, George Ellis, complains that there is not, nor even can be, any direct or indirect evidence for the existence of a multiverse. No one knows if there even are other worlds. But secondly, if we are a member of a world ensemble, then it is overwhelmingly more probable that we should be observing just a small patch of order, which is sufficient for our existence, rather than a finely tuned universe. Such small ordered worlds are simply incomprehensibly more probable than a finely tuned universe, and so if we were a random member of a world ensemble, that is what we ought to observe. But we do not have such observations, and that strongly disconfirms the world ensemble hypothesis. So again, the view that the theist has always held, namely that there is an intelligent designer of the cosmos, seems to me far more reasonable than the atheistic hypothesis that the universe, when it popped into existence uncaused out of nothing, just happened to be, by chance, fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent life with an incomprehensible delicacy and precision. So we can summarize this argument again as follows. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. It is not due to physical necessity or chance, from which it follows three, therefore it is due to design. Finally, the third argument we want to look at is that God makes sense of objective moral values in the world. Take a look at this video, which serves as an introduction to this argument.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem, Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because He is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to, then, is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
Well, I had intended to say something more about this argument, but I don't want to cut into our question time, and I think that the premises of the argument were clearly explained in the video. So let me simply open the floor now to any questions that you might have on any of these arguments. Go ahead and raise your hand and someone will get a microphone to you. Mark will. If these arguments succeed, they give us a personal creator and designer of the universe who is the paradigm of absolute moral goodness, which is a very robust concept of God. Yes?
My question is with respect to what I view as a necessity to accept evolution as God's process of creation rather than his statement of 6 days.
Mm-hmm. I don't argue for the necessity of accepting that. The arguments that I've given are independent of what you think about the biological origins of life or complexity. That's the advantage of the fine-tuning argument. It doesn't end run around this whole emotionally poisoned issue of evolution and creation to go right back to the very initial conditions of the universe and show that even for biological evolution to take place anywhere in the cosmos, it already requires this elaborately fine-tuned set of initial conditions. Yes? Was another question. Here's one over here. You find the one nearest to you, Mark.
Dr. Craig, I was going to find out what you think about Gerald Schroeder's
finding of logarithmic time, which appears to explain
Yes.
the difference between the 6-day creation and the 13.6
Yeah.
billion years.
Schroeder is, I believe, a Jewish scientist who has tried to appropriate the insight of relativity theory that the passage of time is relative to different reference frames in order to say that in God's reference frame, it may be 6 days, but for us, it's a long period of time. I'm not persuaded that that's a good answer because I don't think God is in any reference frame. God transcends space and time. He's not an object which is in uniform motion with respect to other entities. So it seems to me that that's a misconceived solution.
Hi, Dr. Craig. Since I think about the 1970s, there have been a lot of people that have had these near-death experiences.
Yes.
And what do you think of them, and putting them in the context of everything you're talking about?
Yeah. I don't know what to make of these near-death experiences. This is not my area of expertise or specialization, but my colleague, J.P. Moreland, at Talbot School of Theology, has worked in this area, and he's written some books on this that if you're interested, you might look. J.P. Moreland has written a book called Body and Soul. He's also, I think, co-authored something with Gary Habermas where they deal with this. And I know that J.P. is very sympathetic to the veridicality of these experiences, that these are genuine out-of-body experiences by these persons. But I don't make a judgment on that.
How is it that, as you claimed before, that God is good and we have a moral good and evil because God is good, but how is it that a good God can allow bad things to happen to innocent people?
Okay, if I understood the question, you're asking, how is it that if God is good, the world is so filled with evil and suffering on innocent people? Is that right? Yeah. This is an enormous question that deserves more than a soundbite. And I've addressed this question in my book, Hard Questions, Real Answers. In a nutshell, let me just say this. No atheist has ever been able to demonstrate a logical inconsistency between the existence of an omnipotent, all-good God and the existence of suffering and evil. Moreover, no atheist, I think, has ever succeeded in showing that given the existence of an omnipotent and all-good God, the evil and suffering in the world are improbable. In order for him to say that, he has to be in a position where he could say that when you see some incident of suffering, like your daughter dying of leukemia or someone being run over by a car, you have to be able to say, it's probable that God doesn't have a morally good reason for allowing that to happen. And we're simply not in a position to make those kind of judgments with any confidence. God's morally sufficient reason for permitting it might not emerge until hundreds of years from now, maybe in another country, through the reverberations that it sends through history. So I think that the atheist here has a burden of proof that is so heavy that he cannot shoulder it successfully. We're simply not in a position to make those kind of probability judgments. I would say, on the contrary, that given that we have good evidence that God exists and that he is good, we can trust him when he says that he has good reasons for allowing these things to happen. And in the afterlife, he will wipe away every tear and every pain and suffering and give us a life that is unimaginable in its joy forever, so that anyone in heaven looking back on this life, no matter what he suffered, would say, I would go through it a million times over in order to know this happiness. Now that's just scratching the surface, but I think that what I've said is enough to satisfy that problem. Yes?
Regarding the age of the universe and the world, have there been any discussions on the relevance of Jesus' job as a carpenter?
On the relevance of Jesus' what?
Job as a carpenter. Given the motto of carpenters, measure twice, cut once.
You mean the relevance of a carpenter to the creation of the universe?
The relevance of his job, as he could have been a fisherman.
As what?
He could have been a fisherman, but he was a carpenter.
Right. And so what are you asking?
Carpenter's motto is measure twice, cut once.
Oh, I see. So you're suggesting that Jesus being a carpenter is sort of in line with the fine-tuning of the universe, which is so carefully constructed. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I've never thought of that. I think that the fine-tuning of the universe is something that is so incomprehensible that it's better said that God is a mathematician than that he's a carpenter. A carpenter doesn't even approximate the sort of precision that we're talking about here. Yes.
I'm wondering if you could address or explain string theory. Are there more than 3 dimensions? Do we exist in many more dimensions at once?
There are high-level theories of physics, like string theory, that postulate undetectable, invisible, additional dimensions in addition to the 3 spatial dimensions of height, width, and depth that we experience. But there's no evidence for these, and string theory hasn't been able to make any predictions that have been verified that would suggest it's true. So a lot of the enthusiasm has gone out of that program. It's certainly possible that there are additional spatial dimensions that we don't detect. These could be so tiny that we don't discern them with our instruments. It's always possible. But I think at this point we'd have to say there isn't any evidence that there are these additional spatial dimensions.
Dr. Craig, my wife and I, we have a very good, an acquaintance who he's an atheist, a staunch atheist, and it's clear that he would benefit from a lot of the resources that you put forth in speaking online through your website. Do you have any advice, any guidance on the best way to approach someone that you know with all of these resources? Because if they have one question, there are 18 different places you can go to answer the question, but in a way that would, I guess, put it in a more
Well, we have developed these videos, and we're going to continue to do these on the ontological argument, the contingency argument, and so forth. And I would say, share one of these videos with him. Say, I saw this video on YouTube, and that's where these are all posted. And say, it's only 4 minutes long, and I think it's really interesting. Would you have a look at it with me? And see if it starts a conversation. Don't be pushy, but just be invitational. But I think these 3 videos, which have never been shown publicly before this meeting today, are just wonderful resources for communicating to the average person these highly sophisticated arguments.
I may have misunderstood what you said at the beginning. I think you said infinity doesn't exist. If that's what you said, doesn't that give the atheist an argument against the existence of God?
Okay, because of this somewhat of an echo here, I'm not able to quite make out what you said. Did you understand, Mark? Can you repeat, or?
I think at the beginning you said infinity doesn't exist. If that's what you said, does that not give the atheist an argument against the existence of God?
Okay, I'm afraid, again, just because of the acoustics, I'm not...
She's asking, did you say that infinity does not exist?
And how does that impact God as an infinite being? Is that the idea?
As a question, the atheists would use that.
All right. When theologians talk about God's infinity, they're not talking about a mathematical concept. The idea of a quantitative infinity is an infinite number of definite and discrete parts that make up a collection of things. And God's being is not a collection of an infinite number of definite and discrete parts. When theologians talk about God's infinity, it is, as it were, a qualitative infinite, not a quantitative infinite. They just mean things like this: God is morally perfect, omnipotent, necessary, eternal, omnipresent. And none of these things are mathematical, quantitative concepts of infinity. So the argument I've given is quite consistent with God's being an infinite being in the proper theological sense. Well, I'm afraid that that is all the time we have for questions, but I'll be sticking around and happy to talk to people personally. I think Mark is going to come back up to the front now and make an announcement to bring this to a close. Let me just say, though, in conclusion, that if these arguments that I have given do leave us with a personal creator and designer of the universe who is the paradigm of absolute goodness, that still leaves open the question, okay, which God exists? The arguments so far are consistent with any of the world's great monotheistic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Is there any reason to think that God has revealed himself in a special way that we might know him more closely, or has he remained aloof and distant from the world that he's made? Well, that will be the question that we'll tackle in our second session this morning, to which I invite you back. Thank you very much.
Say a special thank you to
Dr. Craig, please.